Okay, my name is Ramirez Biddle, and today we're looking at how race affects education. For the purpose of this assignment, we had to pick between race and socioeconomic status. At first, I picked socioeconomic status, but I decided that you can't look at one and not the other because the two are very much linked. They very much affect each other. Uh, there are lots of poor whites, but how poverty affects whites compared to African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, those minority groups, minority racial and ethnic groups are disproportionately affected by poverty and socioeconomic status, vastly more so than whites. Hold on a minute. The so first, what we're going to talk about will be race. Second, what we're going to talk about, so we're going to define what is race, what is an ethnic group, and how those two are a little bit cloudy. Even though we do have legal definitions, they're still quite cloudy. The other part, the second part, will be about socioeconomic status. So, how does poverty affect education? But there's a bigger picture to that. So, we want to see how poverty affects um, how people address crises and other challenges within their everyday life, which includes or involves having an effect on education. Then we're going to see how the two, race and socioeconomic status, are linked. And then finally, we're going to see, uh, talk about ways of how to mitigate those factors in school. So first, we want to talk about race. And so for the purpose of this project, race, because I'm in Arkansas, we're going to look at this from an Arkansas point of view. So in the book, and the name of this book is Multicultural Education in a Pluralistic Society. This is the loose leaf 10th edition by um, Galnick and Chin. Donna Garlick and Philip Chin. So on page 37, it says a problem with identifying race in the United States by such broad categories is that the categories reveal little about the people in these groups. Whether a person is born in the United States or is an immigrant may have significance in terms of how he or she identifies him or herself. Um, let's kind of break this down a little bit. And I'm glad that they mentioned that because in the United States, we like to put things in perfect little boxes. So racially speaking, we have whites, blacks, Native Americans, Latino and Hispanics, even though they're not a race, You have non-white Latinos, and then you have Latinos. Even though, like I said, they're not a race, they're more of an ethnic group, ethnic and cultural group. And Asians and Middle Easterners. With Middle Easterners, you have Arabics, you have Jews, you have Armenians, uh, and you have other ethnic groups. They don't necessarily see each other as tied to one another. Uh, with Latinos don't often see themselves as black or white. They may see themselves as brown, but they see themselves, all of themselves, as brown. They're more tied to local culture, language, um, food, religion, traditions. With whites are more of a pen group. Whether you come from Germany, whether your folks come from Germany, Ireland, um, England, Scotland, you just, it's mostly seen as that you're still white. There are some differences, some little nuanced differences. I know French whites who have heritage through France and Italy still very much hold on to their cultural identity. And then you look at blacks, um, no matter what part of Africa they come from, once you are here and Americanized, you're considered yourself to be just black African American. But let's look at the word African American, because legally, the definition of an African American is somebody who has roots from Africa. So theoretically speaking, uh, white Africans, and there are quite a few white Africans, can come over here to the United States, become a legal citizen, and have children, which are natural born citizens. By definition, could be considered and legally called, and rightfully so, be called African Americans, even though they do not have the blacks, even though they do not have the black skin color. So, race, how we define it in the United States, is still very, very cloudy, even though we like to have these perfectly uh, box-shaped legal definitions. It's still muddy, to say the least. Let's look at further on in this book, and this is all on page 37. Puerto Ricans and other Latinos do not generally identify themselves by race, even though the U.S. Census asks them to identify their race. Their group identity within the United States is primarily connected to the country from which their families immigrated. And that's and that's very much true. I know I have a lot of Puerto Rican friends, and they don't see themselves as white or black. They just see themselves as Puerto Rican. If they're going to identify any kind of skin color, they're going to say, "Well, I'm brown. My skin is brown," because black is black. Just like this frame right here, that's black. Um, but I look more brown, so I'm brown. Even though you have a lot of dark Puerto Ricans who will say, I'm not black, I'm not this color black, I'm brown. Same thing with Colombians and Chileans and Mexicans and Guatemalans and Nicaraguans. Um, I'm brown. Once you come to the United States, they pick a color that's brown. Um, so race as a social construct is not the same down there in Latin America as it is in the United States, where it's been codified into law. They see themselves as part of a community. They identify themselves not only with country, but the communities that they come from. Uh, they also see that also includes foods, traditions, religions, things like that. So it's much more deep. It's much more deep than just skin color. Um, Now, another pan-racial group, as we turn to page 38, are East Asians. Well, not just East Asians, but Asians in general, because these can be Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. These can be Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, uh, even even Indians from India are considered. They're all considered Asians, and each one of those group are each one of those in that group are vastly different. Even in China, there's more than 20 languages spoken in China, but the national language is Mandarin. So even within each group, there can be several subgroups that they identify more closely with than the more nationalistic look at race, this is Chinese or Korean. Um, it says in this book, it says, many whites see themselves as raceless. They believe that they are normal against which everyone else is the other. They can allow other ethnicities to disappear because they do not see it as a determining factor in their life, especially after their families have been in the United States for generations. Looking at, from my own experience, I have a lot of white relatives that I'm related to by blood, and they do not see um, different ethnic groups within Europe, though within Americans that have European heritage, the same way that everyone else does. You're just white, and that's it. We're not looking at your cultural background. You're just white. You're the normal. You're us. Everyone else is different. Um, this person looks black. This person is black. Is different. Even among mixed children, because in the United States we have, like I said, these perfect little boxes, and so for American society, uh, if you're not white, you're everything else. And that's the way to sum it up, that's the way we look at race in the United States, especially looking at it from the white point of view, is that just like, and this is not unique to the South, although this is more prevalent in the South. Um, if you're not white, you're something else. Even if you're biracial, you're just as much white as you are black, or you're just as much white as you are Latino. Uh, any kind of racial combination, it took two halves to make you the whole, but because you're not fully white, you're the other. Uh, let's take a look at racial diversity. And for this part, we're just going to focus on Arkansas because this is Arkansas. In Arkansas, uh, minorities make up about 20% of the state's population. African Americans make up about, uh, minorities make up a little more than 20%. African Americans make up about 14-15%. Latinos make up about 6%. Other races make up about 1 or 2% as a total, um, and that's up from decades ago, and the number of minorities continue to grow in the state of Arkansas. When it comes to student population in the state of Arkansas, we have 40% minority population in Arkansas. 20% of that alone comes from black students. The other largest group of the other largest group in Arkansas, minority group in Arkansas, are Latinos. Blacks make up about 95,500, and Latinos make up about 63,300. Whites make up 60% of the 490 something thousand students in Arkansas. So whites make up about a little more than 350,000 students in Arkansas, and you can look these numbers up on the Arkansas Department of Education website. However, the number of teachers in Arkansas, 33,000, close to 34,000 teachers in Arkansas, but only 3,750 approximately are minorities. The largest, and that's 11% if you're doing this by percentage. The largest minority group are black teachers, which makes up about 8%, and the second largest group of teachers, minority teachers, are Latinos, and we'll discuss that later. We turn to page 42, and we talk about Brown versus Topeka Kansas Board of Education. The reason why this case is so important is this put an end to the court ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, that the races should be separate but equal. They were separate, but they were not treated equally. And even in that case, you can look at it and see the repercussions of that case, where traditional views on race in America has shown its head, where it's whites, and then you have the others, the remainders, the rest. And so not only were blacks discriminated, but Latinos in the South, in Texas, and the rest of the South, as far all the way across to the Southwest and to the Pacific, were treated just as horribly by whites as blacks were in the South and even in the Midwest. Asians were treated horribly out in the western states, and Native Americans were treated horribly in the middle part of the country. When this court, the Brown versus Board of Education, came up to the Supreme Court, there was evidence that was shown that yes, it was separate, but the resources were very much unequal. Students of color went to schools where they were falling down. Books may have been 20 years old compared to white schools where they had fabulous buildings, up-to-date books. They have vastly more resources than schools of color. And so the Supreme Court said this is wrong. But not only is this wrong in schools, but this is wrong everywhere in American society. And we're still under the effects, we're still suffering from the effects of Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. Let me get my computer charger for a second. And so after the 1954 decision, after the 1954 decision, even still, desegregation was a very slow process. I mean, by the 1970s, we still had some schools that was still deeply segregated. let's fast forward on to modern time. So on page 43 in the same book, um, we have de jure segregation and de facto segregation. So de jure segregation, it was more segregation by law. De facto segregation was segregation. It's a little bit harder to desegregate there because this is more along cultural lines, and this is more of a self-separation, not by law, but just by people moving to certain places, people going to certain schools, neighborhood schools, for example. And so we look at today, and we're as segregated today as we were in the 1960s. Case in point, I just saw a report the other day that New York City has some of the most segregated schools in the United States. Uh, Even in Arkansas, we look at Little Rock School District. Most of the whites moved to the suburbs or put their kids in suburban schools. Even though Little Rock is 50% white, the student population is 90% minority. Where do the white kids go? Well, they went to the suburbs. Even more locally in Magnolia and in Hope and in Texarkana, uh, these cities are more than 50% white, except for Hope. Hope is a little bit more minority. But even though these cities may be 45, 50, 55% minority, the school population, the student population, is closer to 60 or in some cases 70% minority. You would think that the school population would be roughly the same as the population around the school itself. Where do the white kids go? Around Southwest Arkansas, a lot of them went to private schools or through by school choice. They decided that they wanted to go to school districts that were more white. Not necessarily because of performance of the schools that they left. It was more because they wanted to go to a school that was much more whiter. Now, we're going to fast forward in this book here, and we're going to go more towards socioeconomic status. And this is in chapter 3. And we are going to look at what does status mean? And the book does a pretty good job of defining socioeconomic status. We mostly identify socioeconomic status with not only income. Income is important, but it's not just about income. It is about um, where do we live, the kinds of jobs that we have, uh, the things that we do within our community. Because the more wealth or the more income that you have, you tend to be more involved in your community. Because in the more professional jobs you have, you tend to be more involved in your community because you tend to have more time, uh, and you tend to worry more about your household issues as you're more worried about community issues. Whereas someone that is poor, working class, or underclass, you're more worried about household issues because you're worried about how am I going to get through today? How am I going to eat today? How am I going to pay my bills today? How am I going to get where I'm going? And I'm on E and I got $10 to last me the rest of the week. And you're worried about highly personalized, highly home-based issues. And so in this book, we're starting on page 68. Working class is defined as someone that's working more of a blue-collar job, someone that's more factory or in the service industry, working in restaurants. Um, a lot of blue-collar jobs don't make very much money, but you do have some blue-collar jobs that do make quite a bit of money. But most blue-collar jobs do not. They make most blue collar jobs make about 30, between 25, between $20,000 and $30,000 a year. Uh, then you have the working poor that's lower than that makes less money than that. These are people that are working on minimum wage, either full time but mostly part time. And a lot of these people work several jobs just to make ends meet. Middle class, uh, the book says that middle class people bring in about $40,000 to $105,000 a year. In the state of Arkansas, if you make $105,000 a year, you're considered upper class. Um, anything more than $80,000 a year in Arkansas is considered upper class. Upper middle class are people that are more upper management. Uh, these people earn anywhere between $53,000 and $180,000. And then you have the upper class, the top echelon, if you will. These people are more of the owners. They're the business owners, and these are people that are the CEOs, COOs, VPs, executive type positions, senior executive type positions, and owners. And these people make anywhere above $180,000. A lot of these people make incomes that are into the stratosphere. Um, the ratio of pay for the upper class from the lowest paid worker to the top paid workers in 1990 was 107 to 1. Today it's 257 to 1. So for every $1 the lowest paid worker made, the highest paid earner, the highest paid salary person makes $257. That's a huge disparity, a huge gap between 1990 and 2013. And this is on page 71 in the same book. Income is important. And here's how income and socioeconomic status ties to race. This is on page 73. In 2013, African American families earned 57%, $41,505 median income of the average white family, which earns $72,624. Hispanics earn 58%, which is $42,269 compared to white families. Although more whites than other groups are in poverty, 19.5 million, the percentage of whites in poverty is much smaller compared to other groups except for Asians. Of the white non-Hispanic population, 10% fell below the poverty level, compared to 27% of African Americans and 24% of Latinos. In 2013, 7% of whites and 5% of Asians were unemployed compared to 13% of African Americans, 13% of Native Americans, 10% of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, and 9% of Hispanics. Uh, so socioeconomic status do have an effect, and here's how it shows up in education. Even though the gaps in educational attainment have been narrowed along racial and ethical lines, only 68% of African Americans, and this goes on to page 74, and Native Americans, Native Americans, in the book it says American Indians. Um, Students graduated high school within 4 years after entering as a freshman. And the reason being, and Latinos are about the same too, even though it doesn't say that, but I've seen numbers from past classes in public finance and public policy classes that income matters. Income matters when it comes to educational attainment, because the more income you have, the more income your family has, the greater resources that they can provide to make sure that you excel in and out of the classroom. So if you have educational resources at home and during the summer to keep you constantly, to keep your mind constantly sharp, you're going to perform, chances much more likely that you're going to perform extraordinarily well compared to those that do not have those resources because they don't have the money to buy it, or they don't have the money to send you to tutors or anything like that. You're going to underperform compared to students that have everything that they ever need to succeed. Uh, so let's look at how socioeconomic status have a much more deeper effect in education. So I looked up this article in the American Psychological Association. Um, this says that students that come from lower socioeconomic status families, or I like to use economically challenged families, develop develop at a slower rate. They have poor cognitive skills, poor language, memory, and socio-emotional processing skills. They tend to have they grow up to have poor incomes and poor health. They are not likely to have expenses that encourage experience that encourage development of reading, phonological awareness, vocabulary development, and develop oral language. Students with high quality K-3 classes earn more likely to attend college, save more for retirement, and live in better neighborhoods. That is deeply depressing. Literary skills, 5 years. Literary skills of those coming from economically challenged families are 5 years behind those with higher income levels, from students with higher income families. 11.6% of economically challenged students develop or drop out versus 2.8% of higher income students from higher income families. Success and participation in STEM classes are much lower. Top rate earners are 4 times more likely to obtain a bachelor's degree by the age of 24 than those from lower income families. Money matters. Money matters, and that just highlights what I stated earlier about how money uh, can be a great determining factor in the types of resources and the amount of resources one has. And remember those numbers that I said about African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans compared to whites and Asians, East Asians in particular, um, have an enormous effect. Um, I have some notes from an article that I read is how poverty affects behavior and academic performance. Um, this is from a book called Book Teaching with Poverty in Mind. Um, the author's last name is Jensen, and this was published November of 2009. This was in chapter 2 of the book, How Poverty Affects Behavior and Academic Performance. So, as I scroll down to my notes, it says chronic stress with increasing stressors. Poor kids suffer 2 to 3 times more than non poor kids. The total number of several stressors have an adverse effect on the brain. It diminishes the complexity of neurons in the frontal lobe and increase neurons in the um, amy, amygdalin. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Um, makes his brain stressed. Makes it harder to it makes it harder to develop standard memory and learning. So the number, the compounded number of stresses that students from lower income families have to endure have a serious and damaging effect on the brain, because this hints to me that they're more worried about more on survival than educational attainment, which in this position I can completely understand that, because in your everyday life is filled with uncertainty, so you have a lot of anxiety, and when you're very anxious you don't have a lot of brain capacity to really think about, to focus on the learning. Finally, I'm not going to go through every last one of these, but finally, we're looking at a report from Stanford. Is from This was written by Sean F. Reardon. Um, he was a student at Stanford at the time, and he published this report on April 2016. It's and it was through the Stanford Center of Education Policies. And this report was called School District Socio-Economic Status, Race, and Academic Achievement. So, in his report, he has a number. He used a number of graphs, which I thought were great, and it showed, and it included very technical information, not too technical where the average reader couldn't understand it, but it does require a little bit of work. Um, when you're doing studies and you're trying to figure out if the information is relevant, you look at the p-values, and if they're close to zero, the closer you get to zero, the more powerful the relationship is between multiple pieces of information. Um, and for there was a deviation, a p-value, that showed a relationship between economic status and performance had a value of 0.28. That is very, very close. Almost spot on. Very, very close. there is a clear indication that poor disadvantaged schools did worse on academic tests than affluent advantaged schools. By district, when you compare them by the district level, the value, the p-value was 0.84. 0.84. It's still very close. It's under 1. Remember, you want to keep it between 1 and -1. The closer to 0 you are, the more spot on you are. Of the 1,000 poorest schools, only 6.8 or 68 schools tested at or above average. That is very low. Affluent schools, 16 or 1.6% of the schools scored lower than the national average. That is shocking. The numbers that is shocking. I mean that's pretty much almost absolute. Shows that if you're going to school in a poor, lower economic in a district that has a majority economically challenged students, compared to an affluent school, that your ability to fight the barriers, or I won't say your ability to fight the barriers, but the number of barriers that prevents you from excelling are far greater, far more challenging than those students who are going to higher income and affluent schools. There was with 964 schools with 100 black students or more per grade, only 18 districts enrolled about 3,000 black students per grade, scored above the national average. Even with black, white, and Hispanic districts that are similar in socioeconomic status, they have students from similar socioeconomic status. Black and Latinos did worse. Even with black and Latinos in these schools, they scored far lower than whites with similar backgrounds. Between 3rd and 8th grade, high socioeconomic status students gained 1 year of academic growth than students from lower socioeconomic status families. Now, how does this tie in with race? Remember, Black and Latino families and Native American families make up between 52 and 57% of the income compared to the average white family. Income and the ability to have wealth matters greatly, and it shows up along racial lines. Well, someone may ask, well, what about whites that earn the same amount of money as the average black or Latino family? Well, even in this study that I just read, that I just talked about, mentioned, white students with similar backgrounds as Latinos and blacks from economically challenged families scored better than those black and Latino students. What explains that? Because even economically challenged whites have greater access to resources. They have bigger networks, more connections than students that are black, Latino, and Native American. their status as being white gives them still an advantage over someone that is of color, particularly for Black, Latino, or Native American. And this is the reason why I said status and race, you cannot separate the two. They are inextricably linked. Even Black and Latino students from high income families still did worse than students from than white students from middle income families, because white students from middle income families still have more resources, more networks, thicker networks, more connections than high income Black and Latino students. Um, and this shows up even more clearly in a book that I read as a graduate student when I was my master's in public service, public policy, when in a book called When Affirmative Action Was White. Because those laws in the past still affect the present day, because it shifted already fewer resources from those of color to whites, and then it put a lock on those resources. Um, you have neighborhoods with covenants that says, we don't allow people of color. Then you had jobs that didn't hire people of color and things like that. That built up enough of an advantage that could last for decades. That lasts even to this day. That provides resources, an enormous amount of resources, enormously thicker networks, enormously deep connections to things, people that can give you an enormous advantage to make sure that you succeed, vastly more so than people of color. One moment. Well, this is my video on on race and how socioeconomic status affects education, how the two cannot be unlinked, how the two roots back deep into American history, and how the two shapes educational attainment. Now, what teachers can do is to recognize these resources, is to recognize these disadvantages, and help bring in more resources and help bring in more connections in their networks into the classroom by bringing people from the professional world into their classroom to talk about what they see in their profession, what do they need in their profession, how can these students get the skills and knowledge to obtain jobs in their profession, and then have these students to go job shadow professionals and connect students with professionals where these professionals will invest in them and invest time and resources into them and grow the student. Recognize that socioeconomic status and the stressors tied with poverty, these are children, they're not necessarily lashing out at you because you're causing this. You're not causing this at all. They don't know how to communicate their problems. And because if you're stressing them about doing homework, you're adding an additional stressor that they don't necessarily need, because they're going through some real problems at home. And so they would take it out on you, because they will leave you in the next hour or so. They can't ever leave home. Home problems will hang over them for a very long time. So don't take that personally. You just got to figure out and do a little bit more digging and investigating and investing into the student. Don't push the student, but you just got to let them know, hey, I'm here for you. If you want to talk, if you need any help, I will do what I can to help you, but you also got to recognize that you can't allow one or a couple of students to control what you do in the classroom in regards to helping other students out. You can't ignore those. You can't ignore the other students. And you also got to have the right balance between home life and work life, professional life. But getting resources, um, connecting these students with networks, um, and allowing students to see a world that's different from their own would be a huge benefit, in addition to what's going on in the classroom. Because in the classroom, it may not necessarily connect because they don't necessarily see this in their world. They don't necessarily see this as true. But if they can see what's going on in the classroom, what's going on in the professional world, and how they can connect, find little things in their own world, connect to the professional world, they'll figure it out and they'll see the connection. Because it's not like they can't do it. They just don't know how to. They don't know the language of the professional world like higher income families do. And that's the connection that they need. They need to know that language. And that's what's preventing them from getting these professional jobs and having greater economic security. Well, thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and you all have a wonderful day.